Germany, April 1945. The war was ending, but no one knew how to breathe again. The air over the Elbe River smelled of smoke, medicine, and spring rain. Beneath the shredded canopy of a birch forest, an American field hospital pulsed with quiet motion. Stretchers carried, bandages unrolled, boots sinking into mud dark as oil. Inside one of the tents, a small group of captured German women sat rigid on cots, still wearing their gray officer uniforms. Their insignias had been removed, but the habit of silence clung to them like armor. Some were former communications officers, others medical assistants from shattered units retreating east. They watched every movement of their captors, waiting for cruelty, for vengeance, for the punishment they had been warned about. Then, the flap opened. A young American nurse entered, her Red Cross armband bright against her khaki sleeve. She carried not a weapon, but a clipboard and a cup of water. When she spoke, her voice was calm, and in flawless German. The women froze. One lowered her head. Another's eyes filled without sound. For the first time, the war felt truly over. By the spring of 1945, the map of Europe was collapsing faster than the men who had sworn to defend it. The Reich, once spread across a continent, was reduced to a crumbling heart of ruins and smoke. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden lay in ash. The roads were filled with refugees, the wounded, and the remnants of armies that no longer had a front. Amid that chaos marched not just soldiers, but women in uniform. They were the Helferinnen, the female auxiliaries of Hitler's armies, telegraph operators, anti-aircraft spotters, radio specialists, and medical staff. Many had joined under patriotic fervor or the promise of duty. Some were conscripted in the final months when manpower had vanished. They wore the same gray as their male counterparts, saluted the same flag, and repeated the same words about honor and victory. But by April, those words were empty shells. As Allied forces pushed into Germany from the west and the Soviets closed in from the east, thousands of these women found themselves trapped between collapsing lines. In towns like Magdeburg, Bremen, and Kassel, they tore off insignia, hid their uniforms, or surrendered to the nearest advancing unit. For many, surrender to the Americans was seen as salvation. Anything was better than falling into Soviet hands. Yet fear clung to them. Years of propaganda had painted a monstrous picture of the Americans, lawless, vengeful occupiers who would take what they wanted and destroy everything else. German newsreels had shown caricatures of Allied cruelty, nurses being mocked, women being dragged away, hospitals bombed without mercy. Even as the Reich's voice fell silent, those lies still echoed. So when the first American convoys entered the villages of northern Germany, women officers watched from doorways and ditches, expecting the worst. Instead, what arrived was a mixture of efficiency and exhaustion. Trucks bearing food, medics bandaging wounded civilians, military police separating soldiers from prisoners. For the Americans, the war had become a humanitarian crisis as much as a military campaign. Captured women were processed like any other prisoners, searched, identified, and assigned to holding areas under the supervision of military police and medics. The difference lay in the detail. Female POWs, especially officers and nurses, were often placed near field hospitals, not in standard camps, due to their medical backgrounds or injuries. There, they came face to face with women in khaki and olive drab, American Army nurses and Red Cross volunteers. The American Army Nurse Corps, by 1945, had grown to nearly 60,000 women serving in every major theater. Many had followed the advance across France and Belgium, setting up field hospitals within miles of the front. They had tended to American soldiers, Allied troops, and, increasingly, enemy wounded. For these nurses, the Geneva Convention was not a formality. It was a creed. Every human being brought into the tent was treated. To the captured German women, this professionalism appeared alien. They expected punishment, yet they received gauze and morphine. They expected interrogation, yet they were asked about symptoms. And sometimes, in the haze of surrender, they heard a familiar sound, their own language spoken softly by an American. Some nurses had studied German in school. Others learned it through months of occupation work and humanitarian missions. A few were refugees themselves, immigrants who had fled Europe years earlier, now returning as liberators. When they addressed the captured officers in fluent, gentle German, the reaction was often disbelief. For women who had been taught that Americans were brutes, the moment felt impossible. In that silence between captor and captive, something shifted. The war that had taught them to despise suddenly revealed an enemy who could speak like a neighbor. And as April unfolded into May, those encounters, brief, quiet, almost anonymous, began to multiply across the fractured remains of Germany. The language of victory was no longer shouted through guns. It was spoken softly, one sentence at a time. The American system for handling prisoners of war was built not on vengeance, but on procedure. By 1945, the U.S. Army had captured nearly 3 million Axis soldiers across Europe, an unprecedented logistical burden. But within that structure existed a strict adherence to the Geneva Convention. All prisoners, regardless of rank or gender, were entitled to food, shelter, and medical care. For female POWs, that policy was both a shield and a revelation. The U.S. military had not expected to process so many women in uniform. At the war's start, even the idea of German female officers had been rare. But as the front lines dissolved, signals personnel, clerks, and field nurses appeared among surrendering columns. The Americans improvised, using existing medical stations, repurposed schools, and Red Cross stations to house them temporarily. To the captured women, the transition was surreal. Many had spent years within a world defined by rank, ideology, and obedience. They had seen their comrades hanged for desertion, their hospitals bombed, their commanders insisting that surrender meant dishonor. Yet here, under the white and red emblem of the enemy's aid tents, they found warmth, organization, and faces that did not glare back in hatred. The American Army Nurse Corps and the American Red Cross operated side by side in occupied Europe. They treated soldiers and civilians alike, and many were stationed just behind advancing infantry. Nurses worked 12-hour shifts under canvas, surrounded by the constant thrum of generators and the low moans of the wounded. They kept their uniforms immaculate, starched collars, pinned caps, symbols of control in a world that had lost it. Their compassion wasn't sentimental. It was discipline forged in blood and exhaustion. Among these nurses were women who understood the deeper language of fear. Some had grown up in immigrant families, fluent in the European tongues their patients spoke. A few had escaped Europe themselves, daughters of refugees, Jewish families who fled before the war, or exchange students who had watched the continent tear itself apart from afar. For them, treating German captives carried a heavy irony, but also a quiet purpose. They wanted to prove that mercy could exist where hatred had once lived. Reports from Allied field hospitals in late April 1945 describe scenes that still echo decades later. German officers arriving in immaculate uniforms, refusing to speak or make eye contact. Nurses asking for names and ranks, receiving silence in return. Then, a single phrase in German. Sie sind sicher jetzt. You're safe now. It was a simple sentence, but it could shatter months of fear. For many German women officers, that moment of hearing their language from an American mouth felt more disarming than any weapon. It stripped away propaganda, ideology, and pride. They realized that the enemy not only saw them as human, but cared enough to bridge the silence. Across the ruins of northern Germany, similar moments repeated themselves. In makeshift wards in Lübeck, in Red Cross tents outside Bremen, and in converted schools near Magdeburg. The war had taken everything from these women: status, comrades, even belief. But in those encounters, they discovered something that hadn't existed in the Reich: compassion without condition. The transformation wasn't immediate. Many remained suspicious, answering in whispers or tears. Others refused care at first, believing kindness must be a trick. Yet, as days passed and no harm came, as meals were served without insult and bandages changed without contempt, the impossible became ordinary. And when an American nurse, one who spoke their own language, walked into a tent and offered help without judgment, the wall between victor and vanquished cracked. This was the hidden front of 1945, not fought with bullets, but with understanding. And it would soon converge in one unforgettable moment, when silence met speech, and fear met mercy. To understand what those women felt inside the tent that spring, one must imagine the mental collapse of a world they believed unbreakable. The German female officers, mostly from Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht Auxiliary Corps, had lived under strict indoctrination. They had been told they served a superior cause, a disciplined, unyielding nation. Yet when they were captured, that armor of belief dissolved in a single day. Their surrender was not just physical, it was psychological. They were stripped of rank insignias, confined under foreign authority, and forced to confront the enormity of what their side had done. To many, the greatest fear was humiliation. Propaganda had painted American soldiers as cruel and immoral. The women expected mockery, perhaps even abuse. Instead, they met calm efficiency and unexpected restraint. The shock of kindness was profound. Some historians note that female POWs often experienced deeper emotional disorientation than their male counterparts, because their wartime identity had been tied to duty, purity, and discipline. When the captors showed empathy rather than dominance, it inverted everything they had been taught. For the first time, some began to ask themselves, had we been wrong about who the enemy really was? And that question, whispered in the silence of a hospital ward, carried more power than any speech of surrender. The U.S. Army Nurse Corps in 1945 operated with an unspoken creed: every wounded body is a life, not a nationality. That idea had been drilled into every nurse since training. Whether treating Allied troops, civilians, or captured Germans, their duty was the same: to preserve life and dignity. At field hospitals near the Elbe and Weser rivers, American nurses found themselves caring for a mix of humanity: Allied soldiers, German prisoners, and displaced civilians, all within a few meters of one another. They washed wounds, changed bandages, and fed the weak. Often, they worked under fire or in the stench of burned machinery. Many nurses later wrote in letters home that the most difficult patients were not the ones who cried, but those who said nothing. The German women, proud and exhausted, would often refuse food or medicine. Some even attempted to treat their own comrades despite injury. But the American nurses persisted. They understood that care itself could be a message, a declaration that the war's cruelty did not define everyone within it. In the process, they became quiet ambassadors of American values. Without speeches or politics, they demonstrated an alternative kind of power, one rooted in compassion and order. To the German prisoners, the sight of an enemy kneeling beside them, tending their wounds, was more disarming than the sound of artillery. It revealed a truth that uniforms had long hidden: that mercy could win a war more completely than fire. For years, the Nazi state had weaponized fear. Newsreels warned of Allied brutality. Radio broadcasts described Americans as mongrel invaders, and posters portrayed enemy women as immoral. For the female auxiliaries, these messages weren't abstract. They were daily reminders of what awaited them if captured. So when surrender came, and reality contradicted everything they had been told, the effect was destabilizing. The enemy didn't sneer or gloat. Instead, American soldiers handed out cigarettes, offered food, and allowed prisoners to rest. Some guards even shared chocolate, small gestures that shattered years of indoctrination. Psychologists studying post-war testimonies found that this reversal often produced a strange emotional breakdown, relief mixed with shame. A few of the captured women later wrote in diaries that they felt freed and humiliated at the same time. Freed from fear, humiliated by how deeply they had believed the lie. And when one of those Americans, a woman in uniform, a nurse, spoke to them in German, it was as if the last barrier of fiction fell away. This was not propaganda. This was reality. The enemy could speak their words, look them in the eyes, and still choose kindness. It was the final defeat of ideology, quiet, human, and absolute. Language has always been a weapon in war, the first barrier between captor and captive. In 1945, within the canvas walls of Allied field hospitals, it became something else, a bridge. When the American nurse spoke German, the sound alone dissolved the invisible line that divided victor from vanquished. The words themselves were simple. Sie sind in Sicherheit. You are safe now. Möchten Sie Wasser? Would you like water? Yet to the captured officers, these phrases struck like thunder. For months, they had heard only orders barked in English, commands they could not understand, surrounded by unfamiliar voices that reinforced their isolation. But to hear their own language again, spoken by an enemy woman, carried both comfort and shame. It reminded them of home, of a humanity they had locked away beneath loyalty and obedience. Many of those nurses had learned German in school or from immigrant parents. A few were daughters of families who had fled Hitler's Germany in the 1930s. For them, speaking the language of the defeated was not a concession. It was an act of reclamation. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted. The German officers, once proud and composed, trembled not from fear, but from understanding. They realized that their captors were not faceless. They were individuals who could cross boundaries with words alone. In that tent, language became an instrument of peace, more potent than any weapon ever forged. The meeting of American nurses and German officers was more than an encounter between victors and prisoners. It was a mirror of two worlds that had forced women into service under radically different ideals. In Nazi Germany, women in uniform were told their role was auxiliary, to serve, not to command. They worked in communications, logistics, and medicine, always beneath the shadow of the men who led. Their worth was measured by obedience and purity. When the Reich collapsed, so did the system that defined them. Across the lines, the women of the U.S. Army Nurse Corps embodied a different form of discipline. They held rank, authority, and independence that astonished their German counterparts. These American nurses commanded respect from enlisted men and officers alike. They led wards, issued orders, and made medical decisions that determined life or death. To the captured German women, this equality was foreign and unsettling. Watching American women move confidently through the hospital, speaking with authority, challenged everything they had been told about the weakness of democracy and the chaos of freedom. Some German officers avoided eye contact at first, unwilling to accept this reversal of roles. Yet over time they began to observe, not with contempt, but with quiet respect. In that respect, the American women achieved something no battlefield could. They dismantled the myth of superiority without firing a single shot. By April 1945, the world was drowning in the cost of hate. Entire cities had vanished, and millions had died. Yet inside that small tent near the Elbe, the war's final, unrecorded victory was unfolding. A victory of conscience. Compassion had survived. The American nurses treated every wound they could reach, regardless of the uniform it had torn through. They did not ask who was guilty or innocent. They asked only who was bleeding. It was not weakness. It was moral defiance against the brutality that had consumed Europe. The German women, raised in a system where mercy was seen as frailty, witnessed an unfamiliar kind of strength. To care for one's enemy was, in their world, unimaginable. But there it was, real, tangible, undeniable. Historians later called it the quiet front, the moral battlefield fought in whispers and gestures rather than explosions. Every bandage wrapped, every word of comfort, was a small rebellion against the ideology that had poisoned both nations. And when the American nurse spoke in German, she did not merely translate words. She translated the meaning of victory itself. It was not domination. It was humanity. From that moment, the story shifts toward its most intimate turning point. The day when one nurse's voice would break through years of silence and reshape everything the captured women believed about enemies, loyalty, and grace. April 22, 1945, near Magdeburg, Germany, the war's end was now measured not in battles, but in breaths. Every hour, more German units surrendered. Roads once filled with marching columns were now littered with burned-out trucks, scattered helmets, and silent flags. At a converted barn that served as an American field hospital, the wounded arrived without pause. Soldiers, civilians, even captured officers. Among them were the remaining German women officers from a shattered Luftwaffe communications detachment. Their ranks meant nothing now, their insignias stripped. They had been marched from the ruins of Halberstadt, hands trembling from exhaustion and disbelief. Inside the barn, rows of stretchers lined the floor beneath hanging light bulbs powered by a humming generator. The smell of ether and damp straw filled the air. Nurses worked with mechanical precision, moving between patients with faces that betrayed neither pity nor hatred. Among them was Lieutenant Margaret Ellison, the same nurse who had first spoken German days earlier. That morning, the silence between the prisoners and their caretakers broke. One of the German officers, Oberleutnant Erika Reich, was brought in, her arm wrapped in blood-soaked linen. She had been caught in an artillery blast during the retreat. Her face was pale, but her posture remained rigid, as if defiance could still substitute for strength. Margaret knelt beside her, checking the bandages. Rice's eyes flickered open, wary. Margaret spoke softly, in perfect German. Sie müssen ruhig bleiben, Fräulein. Sie sind in Sicherheit. You must stay calm, miss. You're safe now. The words landed with the quiet force of revelation. For days, Rice had been bracing for humiliation, the same vengeance she had seen inflicted elsewhere. Instead, she heard compassion. Genuine, fluent, unguarded compassion. Tears welled in the corners of her eyes, though she turned her head away. Wie können Sie meine Sprache sprechen? She whispered. How can you speak my language? Margaret hesitated before answering. My mother was from Hamburg. She came to America before the war. That single sentence pierced through everything. Propaganda, hatred, fear. For the first time, Rice saw not an enemy nurse, but a woman who could have been her neighbor, her friend, her mirror. The other captured women listened from their cots, every word carrying through the thin air. Some looked at each other in disbelief. Others stared at the floor, unable to process what they were hearing. Margaret continued dressing the wound, her hands steady. We're not here to punish you, she said quietly. We're here because too many people forgot what mercy looked like. For Rice, it was unbearable. Her training had taught her that surrender was shame, compassion was weakness, and Americans were soulless. Yet here was one, speaking her mother tongue, offering safety instead of scorn. She broke. Her shoulders began to shake. Not from pain, from realization. The nurse gently adjusted the bandage and looked into her eyes. The war's over, she whispered. You can stop fighting now. At that moment, the tent fell into silence. Even the distant rumble of artillery, the last gasps of the Third Reich, seemed to fade. Outside, an American jeep rumbled by carrying captured maps and radios. Inside, one German woman officer wept openly for the first time since the war began, not because of defeat, but because of mercy. That day, several nurses recorded similar encounters in their diaries. They wrote about how the German prisoners trembled when they heard their captors speak in familiar tones. One entry simply read, "They did not fear our weapons. They feared our kindness. It was the quietest turning point of the war, and one that no historian could measure in troop movements or casualties. It was fought not with fire, but with words." The moment would ripple outward beyond that hospital, beyond April 1945, influencing the way entire units viewed their captives, reshaping how the defeated and the victorious learned to coexist after years of dehumanization. And in the days that followed, as the Reich crumbled completely, one more confrontation, deeper, more personal, would bring this transformation full circle. The surrender of the German High Command on May 7, 1945, marked the official end of the European War. But inside Allied camps across Germany, the personal wars continued. Thousands of prisoners were processed each week. Officers were separated from enlisted women. Uniforms were burned or stored as evidence. The collapse of the Third Reich had reduced once proud soldiers and auxiliaries to refugees in khaki rags. Yet in the midst of this ruin, a quiet human drama unfolded. One that few reports recorded, but many who were there never forgot. At Camp Ruin, a temporary Allied medical compound near Wolfsburg, the group of captured German female officers from Magdeburg had been transferred for recovery. Some had minor wounds, others were deeply scarred, physically, emotionally, ideologically. They had not spoken much since their arrival. Even the German language had begun to feel dangerous to them, as if it betrayed their shame. But the silence would not last. One morning, as rations were distributed, the sound of the Stars and Stripes played faintly from a nearby loudspeaker. An American victory broadcast. The prisoners stiffened instinctively. They expected mockery, maybe a parade of triumph. Instead, what came through the speakers was the calm voice of a woman. It was Margaret Ellison, reading a public message for medical personnel. A short segment thanking Allied nurses for their service and reminding them of their duty to treat all wounded, regardless of uniform. Her voice was steady, deliberate, and unmistakably bilingual, alternating between English and fluent German for the POWs listening nearby. "Every patient we treat is a human being first," she said. "The war has ended. The healing must begin." Inside the makeshift barracks, a few German women froze mid-motion. Rice looked toward the open door, her face pale. The other officers glanced uneasily at one another. The message wasn't propaganda. It was a declaration of morality, a statement that their captors, even in victory, refused to descend to cruelty. Later that afternoon, Margaret entered the ward with a small team to check on the patients. The German officers watched her move down the line, methodical, calm, her uniform spotless despite the mud outside. When she reached Rice's bed, the nurse smiled faintly. "You're recovering well," she said in German. "You'll walk again within weeks." Rice's lips quivered. She had tried to maintain the composure expected of a Wehrmacht officer, but the effort had worn thin. "Why? Why do you speak to us kindly?" she asked, her voice breaking. "We were your enemy." Margaret took a breath before answering. "Because someday," she said, "someone will have to teach your people how to live without hate." "I can't do that with anger." The words hit harder than any interrogation. They weren't meant to humiliate, only to reveal. Rice lowered her gaze, eyes filling again. Around them, several other German women began to cry silently. The room, filled moments before with the mechanical hum of hospital work, now echoed with quiet weeping. Some of the American orderlies looked away, unsure of what to do. Margaret simply stood still, her expression unreadable, a mixture of compassion and exhaustion. In that instant, the reversal was complete. The women who once served a regime built on fear now trembled before the one force they could not defend against: empathy. That evening, a Red Cross representative recorded the scene in his notebook. His entry was short, but telling. Observed emotional reactions among captured German auxiliaries. American nurse, bilingual, spoke to them in their tongue. Result? Tears, silence, visible shock. Quote, overheard. They treat us as people, not enemies. It was not an isolated event. Across liberated Europe, similar moments played out. Quiet collisions between former foes and the humanity they thought long lost. In hospitals, schools, refugee centers, and makeshift shelters, American nurses and medics stood as living contradictions to Nazi propaganda. They did not mock. They did not gloat. They simply served. And through that, they dismantled decades of indoctrination more effectively than any leaflet or broadcast could. In later interviews, surviving POWs from that group recalled that what broke them was not defeat, but recognition. Recognition that the ideals they had served were hollow compared to the decency of those they'd been taught to despise. Margaret Ellison never considered herself a hero. She returned to the United States later that year, resumed civilian nursing, and rarely spoke of those weeks in Germany. But those who remembered her swore that she had won a war of her own. One fought not with bullets, but with words. By the time the American Medical Corps withdrew from Camp Ruin in early summer, most of the German women were strong enough to stand. Some even helped load supplies for the next convoy, their armbands replaced with simple cloth markers that read, "Patient Helper." For the first time in years, they felt useful without orders, and as they watched the departing trucks disappear into the dust, a few of them whispered something they had not dared to say since before the war. Danke. From that moment forward, the story of the trembling officers and the American nurse who spoke their language would circulate quietly among POW camps and read, "Cross workers," an unwritten lesson that compassion could achieve what conquest could not. When the guns finally fell silent across Europe, the world shifted from destruction to reflection. In the summer of 1945, Allied camps that had once been filled with the noise of engines and prisoners now carried a quieter sound: conversations, questions, and slow reckonings. The German women officers, once symbols of obedience and ideology, were now part of a vast humanitarian dilemma. More than 10 million Axis prisoners of war awaited repatriation or trial. Among them were thousands of women, communications staff, auxiliaries, nurses, and clerks who had served the Third Reich's military machine. The Allied forces faced an unprecedented moral question: how to treat those who had served evil without becoming cruel themselves. At Camp Ruin, where the episode of the bilingual American nurse had taken place, a transformation unfolded quietly. The German women began volunteering to assist the American staff, cleaning wards, translating for civilian refugees, or caring for orphans displaced by the retreat. The same officers who once marched under the eagle and swastika now folded sheets and boiled water for wounded men, Allied and German alike. Margaret Ellison's influence was unmistakable. She treated every patient and prisoner alike, setting a tone that spread through her unit. The American doctors began referring to the women not as prisoners, but as patients under supervision. It was a subtle change, but one that carried profound moral weight, and the German women noticed. Their behavior shifted. The rigidity that once defined them softened into something more human. Many confessed privately that it was the first time they had ever worked under leadership driven not by fear, but by trust. Reports sent to headquarters described the situation in sterile military terms. Camp Ruin, morale high, discipline maintained. German female auxiliaries assisting medical teams. No security concerns reported. But what the reports didn't capture was the invisible change happening beneath the surface. The same women who trembled when they heard English or German spoken by their captors were now learning new words: cooperation, mercy, peace. In late June, an American Red Cross photographer arrived to document the humanitarian side of occupation. He captured a series of images. German women in tattered uniforms working beside American nurses. One of them, believed to be Erika Reich, bandaging a child's arm as Margaret watched nearby. The photograph appeared weeks later in Stars and Stripes, under the caption, "From Enemies to Healers, a New Germany Begins." It was an image that told more than words ever could. It showed the transition of a people, from indoctrinated servants of war to reluctant witnesses of compassion. Even some American soldiers were unsettled by it. To them, the war had been simple: destroy the enemy. But to the nurses it was more complex. The enemy was not just uniform or ideology, it was hatred itself. In that sense, what happened in Camp Ruin represented something larger than a single act of mercy. It symbolized a shift in the very purpose of victory. The Americans had not only defeated an army, they were now attempting to rebuild a conscience. Among the German prisoners, rumors spread of the nurse who spoke their language, how she treated them without scorn, how she told them that peace begins with the living. Some refused to believe she was real. Others whispered her name as if she were a legend, a figure who embodied a strange new idea: that America's strength came not from domination, but from restraint. And as the months passed, that idea began to take root. By the autumn of 1945, Allied command had begun releasing low-risk POWs back into civilian life. Among the first to be freed were the women from Ruin. They left the camp not as proud officers, but as humbled survivors, carrying memories they would never fully share. Each of them returned to a country in ruins, but with something new, a fragment of moral clarity learned from the other side of the war. And for many, that moment in the hospital, when they first heard an American nurse speaking German, would remain the sound of their conscience awakening. In the years that followed the war, history books recorded the great events: the surrender at Reims, the Nuremberg trials, the Marshall Plan. Yet they rarely spoke of the small, quiet acts that reshaped how victory was understood. The story of the German women at Camp Ruin and the American nurse who spoke their language never made the front pages. It survived instead in fragments, letters, Red Cross reports, and the recollections of survivors decades later. But its echoes spread further than anyone could have guessed. By 1946, a number of those former German auxiliaries were working with Allied relief agencies, translating for displaced persons and helping trace lost families. One of them, confirmed by post-war archives, was Erika Reich. She volunteered with the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA. WWII, serving in Hamburg, the same city Margaret's mother had left years earlier. In her first report, Reich wrote a line that would later be cited by post-war sociologists studying reconciliation movements. "I was freed not when the war ended, but when someone I feared spoke to me kindly in my own tongue." That sentence, copied and circulated among Red Cross training manuals, became a quiet symbol of moral reconstruction. It captured what the Allies came to understand too late: that the most enduring victories were not those won on the battlefield, but in the minds and hearts of the defeated. Meanwhile, Margaret Ellison continued her work in silence. She remained with the Army Medical Corps until 1947, then returned home to Illinois. For decades, she never spoke publicly about her experience in Germany. It wasn't until the early 1970s, When a journalist researching female POWs in Allied custody tracked her down, that she confirmed the story. Her recollections were modest. "We were trained to care for the wounded. It didn't matter whose flag they'd fought under. Sometimes the hardest part was realizing they weren't monsters, just people who'd been told lies for too long." The journalist pressed her about Reich and the moment she spoke German in the ward. Margaret only smiled faintly. "I didn't plan it. I just wanted her to understand she wasn't alone." By then, the world had changed. Germany had become a democracy, its ruins rebuilt, its soldiers' children grown into a new generation that studied peace instead of war. But in many of those homes, particularly among women who had served or suffered, the memory of that American voice persisted. Post-war interviews collected by the Institut für Zeitgeschichte in Munich revealed that dozens of former female POWs remembered hearing American nurses who spoke German. Whether it was Margaret or others like her, the impression was the same. They treated us like humans, even when we didn't deserve it. Some said that experience changed how they raised their children, teaching them that strength could exist without cruelty. In one particularly moving testimony, a former communications officer recalled, "I trembled when I heard her voice because I expected judgment. What I heard instead was forgiveness." Historians later described the Allied occupation as the most ambitious moral reconstruction in modern history. But beneath the political programs and reconstruction funds were thousands of small encounters like that, moments of empathy that built the foundation for a peaceful post-war Europe. The nurse who spoke her enemy's language and the officer who wept at her kindness became part of that invisible bridge. By 1948, Camp Ruin no longer existed. The tents were dismantled, the medical equipment sent elsewhere, the ground repurposed into farmland once more. But when Allied historians mapped post-war reconciliation zones, Ruin appeared briefly in the footnotes. Site of early POW humanitarian collaboration. It was a sterile description for something profoundly human. Years later, when Margaret Ellison passed away, her wartime diary was found among her belongings. Inside, on a yellowed page marked April 22, 1945, she had written just one line in both English and German. "To heal is to disarm. Heilen heißt entwaffnen." That line now rests, engraved quietly, on a memorial wall dedicated to military nurses in Washington, D.C. It stands as a testament not to victory, but to the mercy that made victory worth having. War is often remembered in noise, the roar of engines, the thunder of artillery, the cries of victory and defeat. But history's most lasting changes are sometimes born in silence. The silence of a hospital tent where an enemy whispers in your own language. The silence after a trembling hand realizes it will be treated, not punished. The silence that comes when hate finally loses its power. The story of the German women officers and the American nurse who spoke to them in their mother tongue is not one of grand strategy or battlefield heroism. It is the story of a single act of humanity piercing through the wreckage of ideology. In that moment, one nurse, one frightened officer, the war between nations became something smaller, more personal, and finally, it ended. It was proof that compassion could do what armies could not. It could reach the heart of the defeated and plant something stronger than fear, understanding. For every rebuilt city, every treaty signed, there were thousands of moments like this one, unrecorded but essential. They were the quiet architecture of peace. Margaret Ellison never sought glory, and Erika Rees never forgot the sound of her voice. Between them existed a bridge built not of power, but of empathy, a bridge that generations would later cross without even knowing who laid its first stone. History remembers the weapons that ended the war. It rarely remembers the hands that began the healing. Yet it was those hands, gentle, disciplined, unyieldingly human, that showed the world how mercy could outlast even the mightiest armies. And in the long echo of that war, where millions perished and nations burned, one truth still stands clear. Victory is loud, but peace? Peace is quiet.